Yes.
Hi, Dagny.
Hi, Nancy.
Good morning, everyone. I know this is Vince with the Nevada Association of Counties. I see quite a few people logged on, but I do want to just give it like 1 or 2 more minutes just to make sure some people start logging on right at the time. So I just want to give them a minute to sign in, and we'll get started here very shortly. Thanks. Okay, I think we'll get started. Let's see. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay, and we'll just get started. So welcome, and I want to thank everyone for attending today's virtual workshop. The topic and theme of today's workshop is the recently approved American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. The goal of today's workshop is to provide a thorough overview of ARPA, some Treasury guidance information, but also some technical guidance on drafting the required county plans on how you'll spend the money. And we'll go into that, sort of what those are, and sort of throughout the presentation. So again, my name is Vincent Guthrow. I currently serve as the NACO's executive director. Actually, for about the next week. For those of you who don't know, the NACO board recently selected me as the next executive director, and I'll be taking the reins from Dagny on August 16th, who's our current executive director. I have big shoes to fill, and really looking forward to it as we work through our transition here at NACO. So just to sort of guide us through the workshop, I want to let everyone know that today's workshop is sponsored by NACO's Committee of the Emeritus. The Committee of the Emeritus is a group of former county commissioners who advise and assist the NACO board. The committee was formed with the goal of preserving institutional knowledge and expertise and of commissioners who, due to term limits or other factors, are no longer in office, but who possess invaluable knowledge about county government in Nevada. This committee is currently chaired by NACO immediate past president, Humboldt County Commissioner Jim French. Before I provide a brief introduction to the American Rescue Plan Act, I just wanted to take a few minutes and cover some housekeeping items. Sorry, got to bring my notes up here. And then I'll go into the introductions of our experts. So one, if you could just make sure, it looks like everyone's done a good job of it. We're all sort of used to it, but if you could just make sure your phones or computers are muted while you're not speaking to avoid background noise. We do plan on taking questions at the end of the presentation, and we have about 20 to 30 minutes set aside for those. So you could just hold the majority of your questions to the end. And we also sort of designed this format to be sort of a roundtable, more casual discussion. I know that's a little bit challenging on virtual formats, but we do encourage participants to provide input and ask as many questions as you would like. I'm sure someone else has the same question. So one reminder as well, the workshop is eligible for credits under the Certified Public Official Program. That is a partnership that NACO has with that program. And if you'd like to receive credit for the Certified Public Official Program, just contact Amanda here at the NACO offices. And finally, the workshop is being recorded, and we will post a link to it on the NACO YouTube page. So if there's someone from your county who is interested in coming today but was unable to attend, please let them know that these resources will be available. So I do want to just kick it off. I want to take the opportunity to introduce Erin Hurley. She will provide us a look at the most recent guidance from the U.S. Treasury, the ARPA law itself, and an explanation of the allowable use of the ARPA funds. She's been National NACO's sort of liaison to Treasury, so she'll have some good information there. And just a little background on Erin. Erin works for the National Association of Counties, staffs NACO's Finance, Pensions, and Intergovernmental Affairs Policy Steering Committees. In this capacity, she works with county officials across the nation to set NACO's policies on matters pertaining to the financial resources of counties, fiscal management, federal assistance, municipal borrowing, county revenues, federal budget, federal tax reform, elections, and also Native American issues. She has staffed the Human Services and Education Policy Steering Committees and served as a legislative assistant. Additionally, Erin serves as the staff liaison to NACO's Immigration Reform Task Force and assists the group on issues related to immigration. Other responsibilities include staffing the National Association of County Intergovernmental Relations Office. Also with us today is Andrew Belknap. He's a senior vice president at Management Partners. And Andy is based in Las Vegas, Nevada, has more than 20 years of local government experience. He served as a city manager, public works director, and along with a variety of interim management positions as a consultant to many California municipalities and special districts. He is an expert on local government financial management, has led numerous projects to address structural fiscal deficits for local governments, including the cities of San Jose, Fremont, Santa Ana, Santa Cruz, Bakersfield, Sacramento, and Tracy, as well as the ports of Oakland and in West Sacramento. Andrew has a very extensive background. During 2008 and 2009, he served as an expert witness in the city of Vallejo's bankruptcy proceedings. And in 2011 and 2014, he serves as a project manager for the city of Stockton, process mediation, and subsequent bankruptcy and recovery. Due to this extensive background, Andy is an expert at developing alternative service delivery arrangements, as well as revenue development over a broad array of municipal services, including law enforcement, fire, EMS, code enforcement, public works, parks and recreation, as well as community development. Andy has served well over 200 California and Nevada local governments, many on multiple occasions. He's a trained economist, and Andy brings a special expertise to fiscal analysis and public finance issues. His practical understanding of public services and management systems adds value to all types of organizations and policy analysis. And working with a detailed long-term fiscal model, Andy and management partners have developed a tool for modeling revenue loss and other eligible funding uses as specified in the American Rescue Plan Act, the legislation and the Treasury rules. The model will be used in workshops considering alternative uses of ARPA funding. Andrew's a national, like I said, Andrew's a national consultant based in Las Vegas, Nevada, and has assisted counties and other local governments in drafting their local plans. And he'll go into what goes into a formal plan to submit to Treasury and provide some do's and don'ts of the planning process. Lastly, and also with us is Nancy Paulson. She's the city manager for Carson City. They are a consolidated municipality, but Carson did a wonderful job in creating their plan to expend their CARES dollars, which is the initial federal legislation that responded to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Nancy is here to provide us with an on-the-ground example of what the Carson City plan looks like. Little background on Nancy. Nancy Paulson was raised in Northern California and moved to Nevada in 1988 to attend the University of Nevada, Reno, where she earned her Bachelor of Science degree in accounting. Nancy is a certified public accountant who began her career at a public accounting firm. While in public accounting, she worked in both tax and auditing. Her auditing engagement consisted of banks, gaming establishments, school districts, and local governments. After spending over 6 years with the firm, she accepted a position with the Carson City Finance Department, and she's been with the city for over 20 years, working her way up in the finance department as an accounting manager, deputy finance director, and chief financial officer. In August of 2017, Nancy was promoted to deputy city manager, and in December of 2018, she was appointed to serve as city manager. She's lived in Carson for almost 23 years with her husband, John, who's a history teacher at Carson Middle School, and she have 2 children here that attend college. So again, thank you to all the members of our panel for being willing to join us today. I do just want to take a moment to kick off this workshop and go over just a brief overview of ARPA. I kind of thought that would set the stage for everyone, and then I'll send it over to Aaron. So just a brief summary. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 was signed into law by President Biden on March 11th of this year. The legislation is intended to combat the health and economic impacts of COVID-19, as well as provide resources to combat any future public health emergencies. The comprehensive legislation included nearly $2 trillion of funding in a variety of categories, such as small business assistance, housing, temporary food assistance, mental and behavioral health, as well as for vaccine distribution and continued testing and contact tracing efforts. The component that we'll focus on today is the nearly $362 billion of direct federal aid that went to state and local governments, including $65.1 billion for counties. And there was an additional $1.5 billion in there for public land counties across the country. Of that, Nevada counties received direct aid allocation in the amount of around $608 million. And there are for general uses, and Erin will go into more details during her presentation about what these mean, but the allowable uses are 1, to respond or mitigate to the public health emergency and the negative economic impacts, provide for recovery of lost revenue, 3, to fund, another one is to fund water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And you can also pay for essential workers or provide for those that provided essential work throughout the pandemic. Under the provisions of the law, Treasury was required to provide the first installment of funding no later than 60 days following the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act. So counties should have received that already. And the second payment will not come any earlier than 12 months following that initial installment. All funds must be expended by December 31st, 2024, and an initial uses report is due to Treasury by August 31 of this month, actually, which is why we're having this workshop now. Some other funding included in the legislation that is beneficial to counties. There was an extension of the federal Medicaid assistance percentage, or FMAP, as well as additional funding for vaccine distribution and FEMA assistance, which included an elimination of the local match, which I think has been cost prohibitive to some counties when pursuing FEMA funding. With that, and I hope I didn't overlap too much on Erin's presentation, but I wanted to turn it over to her for a more detailed explanation of the allowable uses, and along with sort of the Treasury guidance and how those conversations have gone, and that should assist your counties in understanding ARPA and drafting those plans. So Erin, if you can hear me and you're ready, you're up.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Vince, for that introduction. You did not overlap too much at all by any means. And thank you to NACO and the Nevada counties for inviting me to be here today. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen quickly. All right. Can everyone see that okay? All right. As Vince mentioned, of course, the American Rescue Plan authorized the state and local fiscal recovery fund. That was a total of $362 billion allocated to state and local governments. As part of that, counties were provided $65.1 billion in direct and flexible funding. So for today's presentation, what I wanted to do was, of course, just walk through the allowable uses of the recovery funds, touch on some of the key updates of Treasury's FAQ documents, and then we can walk through some of the reporting requirements as well too. Of course, as Vince mentioned, those dates are coming right up around the corner. So first and foremost, I'm not going to go through this entire slide just because of time, but wanted to point out some of the key highlights when we're talking about Treasury's interim final rule that they released back in May. So first and foremost is that there is a lot of broad flexibility in terms of how you can actually use recovery funds, especially when it comes to supporting populations that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, also known as QCT or qualified census tracts, QCTs for short. When we're talking about the time period for actually how you can use recovery funds, that covered period is from March 3rd of 2021 until December 31st of 2024. However, there are some exceptions in terms of when you can actually spend this money. For example, premium pay, which we'll get into detail more, can be used retroactively. But there is some flexibility in terms of that beginning date for the cover period. And then that December 31st, 2024 deadline is simply just when you need to obligate funds by. You have until December 31st of 2026 to actually spend or perform all of the activities under the recovery fund. Number 5, there's no deadline for counties to certify. Treasury is in fact still sending out the money to date, and we're working with a lot of counties to make sure that they are able to certify, since it is a rather new process. In terms of some new clarification from Treasury that we know now is that recovery can be deposited into interest-bearing accounts. Whatever money that you do deposit into interest-bearing accounts, any of that interest earned, you can actually use it on however your county would like to. It is not restricted to the allowable uses under the recovery fund. A very important piece when you are developing your recovery fund plans is to know the differences between the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund and the ARP Fiscal Recovery Fund. There are a lot of similarities in general, I would say, but there are also some very key differences. First is the restrictions around covering county employee payroll support, especially when it comes to public health and public safety workers, the restriction in using funds for tax anticipation notes or TANs, and then also not being able to use recovery funds for the non-federal match. And then finally, in terms of just some key other allowable uses, is that you're able to use the funds to rehire local government staff to those pre-pandemic levels, so prior to January 27th of 2020. You can use the funds for routine pension costs for employees. And then, of course, you can also use recovery funds to invest in water, sewer, and infrastructure projects. So just wanted to touch on the 2 August 31st dates on this slide very quickly. But overall, these are the key dates that you should definitely become familiar with for the recovery fund. August 31st is when 2 different reports are due, but depending on the number of reports your county has to submit, it's dependent upon your county's population. So the first report that's due is the interim report. And all counties have to submit an interim report to Treasury. This is a one-time report. We are still waiting for the template or the user guide for Treasury to actually release that. I spoke with Treasury actually just yesterday. They are expecting to release that template on Monday, on August 9th. But again, you have to submit that interim report. We don't expect that there will be too many details that you have to submit, just simply how you're actually allocating or have obligated or spent the dollars. If you haven't spent or obligated or passed any sort of plan, you can just say that you haven't spent any of the money yet or obligated. The other plan that's due that only applies to counties with populations of 250,000 and above is the Recovery Plan Performance Report. That is a lot more lengthy. NACO is actually working right now to gather these templates that counties have already completed. Treasury has most recently, just this past week, uploaded the template on their website as well too. For this plan, it'll have to be done on an annual basis. And in terms of when it's due on August 31st, as your county is developing it, you should just definitely think forward thinking, what's in the next year? How do you expect to, spend these dollars? You're not, obligated to exactly follow the plan per se. You're allowed to make modifications the next year after you submit, but you just need to show how you plan to spend the funds. So this goes into some more detail in terms of the reports. So interim report, as I mentioned, this is in terms of the expenses that you cover. Whenever your county certified for the funds, it's that date up until July 31st of 2021. So just make sure that you know that date that you certified. The project and expenditure report, this is different than the recovery plan performance report. The first project and expenditure report is actually not due until October 31st. So you have some more time. And then again, the frequency in which you actually submit the expenditure report depends on whether your county received above or below $5 million in total for your award. So if you received above $5 million, your reports are due quarterly after that October 31st date. If you're under 5 million, those reports are due annually. So, but similar to the recovery plan performance report, the project and expenditure report does require more information, more data in terms of how you are spending the money. Why the expenditure report and the performance report, why they are required to have more information is that in contrast to the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund, where it was really just reporting out how counties spent the money or the recipient spent the money, is that Treasury is really looking to actually identify tangible outcomes for how the money is being spent, and really wants to kind of like uplift these evidence-based approaches. So the next several slides are just additional clarification and updated FAQ document iterations that Treasury has released over the last month and a half or so. So this one was released in June. We have written confirmation now that you can use the recovery funds to cover costs of consultants. You can also use the funds to establish public jobs programs. So this is subsidized employment, combined education and on-the-job training. You can also use the funds to cover childcare assistance if someone is going back to work, they need childcare, you can use the recovery funds to cover their childcare expenses. Also, for transportation expenses for an individual that is going to and from their workplace, you can also use recovery funds to cover those. There was more clarification around the revenue loss language. There was a number of iterations in the FAQ document around revenue loss. We're going to go into detail in just a second. Number 4, I kind of alluded to earlier, is the flexibility for costs incurred by March 3rd of 2021. We can kind of get into that maybe during the questions portion, but something to just remember is that when Treasury is talking about an incurred cost of the recipient, it's a difference between the recipient being the county or the recipient being a household or a business. So you could cover costs if someone is behind on their rent for the last 4 months, that was prior to March 3rd, but it wasn't charged to the county until after March 3rd. You can actually use recovery funds to cover their rent or backfill their rent. The CFDA number, that's just important since we're talking about the upcoming reports. You just need to make sure that you have the correct CFDA number. And then that final point is that you do not need pre-approval from Treasury for any of your water, sewer, broadband projects. It's simply that you just need to read through the interim final rule, make sure that it is in compliance with the IFR's requirements, and then you can go ahead and get started. For this iteration of the FAQ document, number 1 is actually very important because we've received a lot of questions around qualified census tracts, negative economic impact. Do you have to assess household by household for how they were actually negatively impacted? The answer is no. You can actually just demonstrate that if a population or group level was negatively economically impacted by COVID-19, you're able to provide those services to that population or group level. For the outdoor spaces, a lot of flexibility in how you can use recovery funds towards those services. But I do want to just touch for this presentation, touch on that you can use funds for park and recreation. Treasury acknowledges the fact that parks were used a lot more during the pandemic, so there was a lot more wear and tear. Counties may not have been able to invest in those repairs in the immediate, so you can use recovery funds for the maintenance of those parks and upgrade of those parks. Number 3 on the screen was really huge, and one that NACO actually worked very closely with Treasury to get included in the updated FAQ, is that you can use recovery funds to expedite court case backlogs. So you can use funds towards safety measures. You can actually use funds for hiring court staff and attorneys and actually pay for their payroll. Any sort of expenses that are associated with helping speed up those backlogs that you can use. Number 6 on the screen here is also a big one. Treasury expanded allowable uses around addressing increased violence and crime during the pandemic. These allowable uses came out at the same time as when the Biden administration released their strategic plan for addressing increased violence and crime during the pandemic. So there's a long list of different programs and services that you can invest in. You can hire law enforcement staff to actually before pre-pandemic levels and above. So a lot of flexibility around that piece. For the most recent FAQ document, I think one that's very important is that very first bullet that is bolded, in terms of being able to use the recovery funds to support nonprofit and private organizations. So you can administer the funds to both of those groups, especially nonprofits that may be providing other critical support services to your residents across the community as well too. Number 3 on the screen here, the fact that you are allowed to pool funds for regional projects. So your county can transfer funds to a neighboring county or work with state and local partners to invest recovery funds. This is really big, so you can commingle projects and fund one project that could benefit multiple regions and multiple counties. Prior to that, there was no clarification on that, and you weren't necessarily able to do that. So this is definitely a big one as well. And then finally, in terms of number 7 on the screen, there was clarification around the Davis-Bacon Act. So these are the fair labor wage standards. Treasury provided clarification in the fact that these requirements do not apply to projects that are funded solely by recovery funds, except for those undertaken in Washington, D.C. And simply, I just need to say that if your county has not registered for funds yet, or is having difficulty certifying for the funds, this screen here just points you to Treasury's homepage. The information that you're going to need is a DUNS number, SAM registration, and then payment information. Treasury actually put together a document for NACO and counties for submission tips of how it walks you through the portal, the ID.me kind of platform. So if you're having any sort of issues at all, if you haven't received your money yet, I'll drop my email in the chat. Please feel free to send me a note and we can definitely connect you with Treasury and walk you through the portal as well. So broad overview, and I know Vince mentioned this, so not going to touch on this for too long, but this just lays out how you can actually use recovery funds in the broad sense. So supporting the public health response and addressing negative economic impacts are definitely the most broad categories. Really, if you can just link back the project activity service that you want to use recovery funds to cover for, you just simply need to link it back to COVID-19 and its impacts. A lot of flexibility. You can use funds to replace lost revenue, provide premium pay to essential workers, and then of course you can invest in water, sewer, and infrastructure projects, which we'll get into each one of these now. So in terms of replacing lost revenue, we'll go through the actual formula in just a second, but this category C within Treasury's interim final rule is very unique. Think of this kind of pot of money, your revenue loss funds, as separate to your other recovery funds, because once you calculate your county's lost revenue and determine, okay, we're going to use this portion of our recovery funds for revenue loss or to replace the revenue loss, you can then use those funds to support government services. So it doesn't have to be related to COVID-19 or its impacts. So you can use the money to invest in maintenance of infrastructure, or paid go spending to actually build new infrastructure. So that's roads, bridges, buildings. You can use it towards cybersecurity, including hardware, software, protection of critical infrastructure, healthcare services, environmental remediation, police, first responder, and other public safety services. The only real restrictions around using revenue loss funds is that you cannot use them for debt services or put them into rainy day funds. So again, a lot of flexibility when we're talking about the revenue loss. Simply on the screen, this just kind of outlines for you some of the key items when your county is calculating its revenue loss. So you're able to calculate your county's revenue loss at 4 points in time. So December of each year, 2020 to 2023. That's just because Treasury acknowledges the fact that revenue loss oftentimes lags, especially property tax. So they want to make sure that you have the opportunity to recalculate and make sure that you're able to capture that revenue loss. The definition of general revenue on here, Treasury uses the Census Bureau's definition. So that includes revenue from taxes, current charges, miscellaneous general revenue, intergovernmental transfers between state and local governments, and then excludes many other revenue streams as well. I think the most important differentiation to make between what's included and excluded in terms of intergovernmental transfers, again, it includes transfers between state and local governments, but excludes transfers between the federal government and local governments. It excludes if there is a federal grant. So for example, we've been hearing a lot with wildfires, federal government provided a grant, disaster grants, or disaster support to counties. Yes, maybe it went through the state, but you would still exclude that because it's a federal grant via the state to the county. And then finally, you should be calculating your revenue loss on an entity-wide basis. You cannot kind of segment your revenue streams from one another. On this screen here, simply, it just demonstrates in terms of when you are calculating your revenue loss, Treasury has provided you with two options to use when inputting the formula. So you just determine your average revenue growth for the last 3 years. If it's lower than 4.1% per year, or lower than that 4.1%, you take that 4.1% for your growth adjustment. If it's higher than 4.1%, you use that average growth for the last 3 years when calculating your revenue loss. This tool here, simply, NACO worked with the Government Finance Officers Association to create this revenue loss calculator. I'll post the link in the chat after this, but urge you to go to our webpage, our revenue loss webpage, where you're able to calculate your revenue loss. It is extremely helpful, and it identifies which streams to include or exclude. This premium pay piece, what premium pay is that you can provide an additional $13 per hour on top of an individual's regular hourly rate to eligible county workers performing essential work during the pandemic. So essential employees are defined by Treasury as any work performed by an employee of the state, local, or tribal government, staff at nursing homes, hospitals, home care settings, janitors, sanitation workers, that list goes on right there. In addition to an essential employee, Treasury also provides the essential work definition. So essential work is defined by work involving regular in-person interactions or actual physical handling of items between people. So a worker that would not be engaged in essential work if they are teleworking or if the work is performed at a residence. In order for an employee to receive premium pay, they have to be both an essential employee and performing essential work. So that's very important to know. And then finally, premium pay can be used retroactively. So that means that you can provide premium pay to those essential workers performing essential work all the way back to January 27th of 2020, when the public health crisis was declared. And then finally, I just do want to mention is that, as counties, you actually can provide grants to third-party employers that are, employing eligible workers, performing essential work. There just might be some additional reporting requirements around that. Moving on to the water and sewer infrastructure. So we all know you can use recovery funds in this way. what Treasury ultimately did in terms of eligible projects is that they aligned those uses with that of the Environmental Protection Agency's two state revolving funds, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So you just need to make sure that you are familiar with those eligible projects under each one of those state revolving funds as you are considering which projects to implement as well too. And again, you do not need pre-approval from Treasury in terms of which projects. You just need to read the IFR and the eligible projects under the revolving funds. And then finally, for the broadband infrastructure, there's a huge emphasis on broadband within Treasury's interim final rule. In terms of eligible projects, Treasury says that recipients should be investing in projects that are able to deliver reliable services. So what they say is that it's the minimum 100 megabits download, 100 megabits upload speed. However, there is flexibility around this threshold based on whether it's excessive cost, because of geography of the county. So there is some flexibility. Specifically, it can be 100 megabits download and then ranges from 20 to 100 megabits upload speed. So flexibility around that. Treasury also is encouraging that recipients target households that do not have reliable connectivity. So that means they don't deliver 25 megabits download and 3 megabits upload as well. And then on the right of the screen, this is another iteration of Treasury's FAQ document that provided some additional guidance around broadband investments. Simply what it provided clarification on was there were a lot of questions on, okay, you know, there might be households that reach that 25 megabits download, 3 megabits upload, but other houses in the region don't. Does that mean that we can't invest? You still definitely can do that. Treasury is very supportive of a very holistic approach, if you will, when investing the recovery funds. So again, there's a lot of flexibility when you are targeting specific households and businesses and regions within your county to invest in broadband projects. And then finally, you can also use recovery funds to invest in those middle mile projects that ultimately help achieve some of those networks and ultimately leverage middle mile networks as well. And then the last item here is just wanted to quickly provide an overview in terms of the ineligible expenses. You cannot simply take the recovery funds and put them into a pension fund. You cannot do that. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is that you can use recovery funds for routine payroll contributions to pensions of employees whose wages and salaries are in eligible use. And then in terms of the other restrictions, you cannot use the fund for debt service payments, legal settlements, or judgments. As I mentioned earlier, you can't deposit into rainy day funds or financial reserves, and you cannot use funds for the non-federal match requirement as well. And then that third one, the net reduction in tax revenue, that only applies to states and territories, so it does not apply to counties. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it back over to Vince, but thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you, Erin, so much for that presentation. Next up is Andrew Belknap from Management Associates, and he'll be just providing what could go into a local ARPA plan and sort of that planning process. So Andy, you're up.
Okay.
Oh, Andrew, I should mention, so we are advancing the slides for you.
Okay.
So just let us know when you need us to scroll to the next one. I think that'll help our office manager who's working on this.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Vince. Andy Belknap with Management Partners, and we are currently working with local governments around the United States on ARPA plans. But the largest local government that we're working with is Stark County, Nevada, and I'm going to give some examples from the plan that they're working on. Can we have the next slide? So this is just a little bit about our firm. We work exclusively with local governments in the United States, and cities, counties, and special districts. And It's been very busy in the last year with CARES and now the recovery plan, rescue plan. Next slide. Aaron covered this really well, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but I do know in Nevada we have counties that fall in every one of these designations. So the reporting requirements do vary based on your population and how much money that you're receiving. Next slide. So some things to keep in mind from Treasury guidance. They're very interested in documentation of transparency and community input. They are trying to strike a balance between moving quickly and moving carefully. It kind of brings to mind that John Wooden quote where he said, "Be quick, but don't hurry." And that kind of sums up what their guidance is in terms of the timing on all this. And I know it can be, I know in working with elected officials, it can be sort of challenging to try to come up with a plan for this much money. And what I have always emphasized is you do have flexibility. I think Aaron was really good. Can I have the next slide? So, and I won't dwell on these eligible uses either because Aaron covered it really well. Next slide. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, great. Thank you. One of the things to keep in mind is that the counties are going to be the first line of defense in terms of appropriate spending. So the guidelines are really clear that if you don't spend the money correctly, they will take it back. So it's important. I know all of you have worked with FEMA over the years. So you all know how important documentation is for the inevitable arrival of the auditors. So we're stressing that as well as documentation for all spending. Next slide, please. So, and I won't, each, depending on your size, there's different filing requirements, but everybody has to file something by the end of August, the interim plan, and depending on size, the performance report. Next slide. So this shows that some actual community input that we've received in Clark County. We've had the survey is still open, but we've had about 3,500 submittals to the community survey that's up. And this is going to be, I think, extremely useful to commissioners in making determinations. But you can see that affordable housing, mental health services, healthcare, homelessness, education, K-12 education, it's not strictly the county's responsibility, but I think, as Aaron mentioned, there's a lot of early childhood education possibilities, especially in the qualified census tract areas. And then finally, job opportunities, all ranked really high. The different colors of the bars, you don't have to worry about too much, but those are based on whether people ranked it as a first priority or second or third or fourth priority. I think another good way, particularly for smaller local governments, to take advantage of community input would be to tap into what the state of Nevada is now doing with their Every Nevadan Recovery Framework. They're going to be doing, they have a survey that's up, and they're going to be doing about 75 community engagement exercises over the next several months. And I know that they'll be posting that information. I think it'll be real useful in terms of orienting any plan within Nevada. The next slide. So Treasury really emphasizes doing community engagement, and then especially if you're doing a performance report. And I don't think I completely agree with Aaron. The performance report that's due this year is not going to be, you're not going to have a lot of experience with the spend. But next year, the performance reporting is going to become really helpful. And I think being able to tie it back to community engagement, both during the development of the plan and as you spend the money, is going to be really important. Next slide. So if you haven't already, I would suggest that you look for the qualified census tracts within your county. I think I took a quick look, and I think virtually every county in the state has these lower income census tracts. This graphic shows what the qualified census tracts are shown in purple within the Las Vegas Valley, and there's other qualified census tracts in the outlying areas of Clark County. There's about 100 in all, and these just open the door to much broader uses for the funding. And when you hear people talk about the sort of the generational opportunities involved with these dollars, many times they're thinking about these pockets of poverty that have many needs that haven't been addressed for some time, and this could be literally life-changing within those neighborhoods where you have a broader use for the funding. Next slide, please. So the thing to look for is a poverty rate of greater than 25% or more, or a median household income below 60% of the area median base income. Quite a few of these areas within Nevada, and you can very broadly address educational disparities, invest in housing and neighborhoods, and generally promote healthy childhood environments. So it really does present a great opportunity within these lower income areas. The next slide, please. One of the things that we think is important to do within Clark County is to pay attention to the Every Nevadan framework and tie back to the state priorities. And so if you haven't already looked at those, they're noted on this slide. And several of them really do tie back well to what Clark County learned in its community surveys learning. So increasing access to healthcare and community-based services, strengthening education, supporting disadvantaged communities. These are all goals, strategies from the state. Next slide, please. Another thing that Clark County has open right now is in trying to get a picture of how to help nonprofits, other private entities, and also public agencies. They have a survey up now that's asking for projects and programs that would meet the rescue plan requirements. And this just shows this is a snapshot as of last Friday in terms of what Clark County has received. You can see that it's almost, I'm sure it's over 400 discrete requests now, totaling a little over $2 billion. Of course, the county of Clark County is getting $440 million. This will give you a sort of a sense of where those requests are coming from. Next slide. If you are doing a performance report, the rescue plan work becomes pretty much exponentially more complicated. Not so much this year, but for the report that's going to be due at the end of August in 2022. This is the key sections, and as Aaron mentioned, they just put up a template that can be used for reporting, which is handy. And if you're doing a performance report, you should take a look at that. And I think that's it. I will also post my next slide, please. I'll post my email in the chat as well. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to email me, and I'll put my phone number in there too. So I'll turn it back to you, Vince, and thanks for the opportunity to present how we're doing a real plan here in Buck County.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. I really appreciate that. And next up, we have Carson City Manager Nancy Paulson, and she, I think, just got her plan approved by the Board of Supervisors yesterday. So she has a good, solid example of an on-the-ground plan. So Nancy, if you want to take it away, that would be great.
Right, good morning. I was hoping my presentation was going to work. So yes, we just did get it approved yesterday by the board. So that's great news. And I'm hoping that it's in alignment with all the rules and regulations that we already just talked about. So, so Carson City is a consolidated municipality. So we were allocated 9.9 million from the city allocations and 10.9 million under the county allocation. We received 50% of the funds in June of 2021. We waited a few weeks because I think Aaron talked about it earlier. We didn't know whether you could deposit the funds into an interest-bearing account until I think it was sometime in June. So then we can draw the remainder of the funds. We have to wait until May of 2022 or June of 2022 to draw the rest of the funds. So sorry, some of this is kind of, we've already talked about this morning, but community engagement, how should Carson City spend 20.8 million from the ARP funds? As stated in the interim final rule, Treasury urges local governments to engage their constituents and communities in developing plans to use these payments. Given the scale of the funding and the potential to create broader economic recovery and rebuilding. So our mayor started this out by having a discussion at a coffee and conversation with the mayor that was held on June 10th, where the community was encouraged to submit ideas for the funding. We received probably between 20 and 30 suggestions, most of which have been incorporated into the city's plan. In addition, we asked all of our departments to submit ideas for what we could spend the funding on also. So on July 19th, city staff presented a recommended plan of expenditure at a special workshop of the Board of Supervisors. And then based on that discussion and direction from the board, the city's plan was approved yesterday on August 5th. So I'll start out first with what we know is not an eligible expense under the ARP funds. And that's, as they mentioned earlier, our payments into a pension fund, also interest in principal on outstanding debt, replenishing rainy day funds. So you can't deposit any of the funds just into your general fund balance account. And the last one is to offset tax cuts. So for example, we're not allowed to reduce the city's property tax rate and then use the ARP funds to replace that lost revenue. These are, we just broke down the eligible uses into the four different categories. The first one is respond to the public health emergency or its negative economic impact, replace lost public sector revenue, provide premium pay to essential workers, and invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. These funds have more restrictions, I've noticed, than the CARES funds did. Most of the provisions of the uniform guidance and the single audit requirements apply to this program, whereas under the CARES funding, due to the state of emergency, they were only subject to a few of the provisions. So most notably for us, we're required to ensure that purchases are consistent with all the federal procurement standards. So in developing the city's plan of expenditure, we considered the priorities of the Board of Supervisors that we've identified in our 5-year strategic plan. And this helped us to build a roadmap to develop our plan of expenditure. So what's included in the city's plan? Section 1 covers city payroll and benefits for public health. We have included 3 health department positions for approximately $900,000 to cover 3 years of salaries and benefits. As we all know, the health department was on the front lines of the COVID fight, and these are critical needs of the department to allow them to respond to the pandemic, but they also need to carry on with all the other functions of the health department during these types of events. Under Section 2, services and programs to contain and mitigate the spread of COVID-19, we allocated $5,275,000. The first one is ventilation improvements, HVAC systems. We allocated $2 million, and this will fund projects from the city's fiscal year 22 and 23 capital improvement program. Funding for these capital projects is usually paid out of the general fund. So if we fund these instead under the ARP funding, that frees up general fund dollars for other capital projects that don't have the restrictions of the ARPA funds. The next one is remodel a vacant building for the Public Health Preparedness Division, $100,000. So during the pandemic, with the addition of 30 plus health department employees, they quickly ran out of space. And that required us to spread these employees out all over the city. They were at the community center, the senior center. We had to actually rent an office space. So we had a very old vacant building that needed a lot of work, and we were actually getting ready to sell that. But instead, we changed plans and we spent $100,000 on improvements, and that Public Health Preparedness Division has been relocated over to that building. Under C, Vitality Unlimited, to relocate them from the Health and Human Services second floor to free up space for the increase in the operational needs of the health department, $500,000. So another space issue that the health department has is that Vitality Unlimited is occupying the second floor of our health department building. They provide critical services to our community and the city. They're a detoxification and substance abuse treatment program. And the beds are utilized by our courts under our specialty court programs. So eligible uses under negative economic impact include providing rental assistance to nonprofits. So the plan here is to work with Vitality and to find another location and cover their rent for approximately 3 years, and then they would take over that after the 3-year period. Under D, Emergency Operations Center, Fire Station, and Backup Emergency Dispatch Center, $1.9 million. So the city has known for several years that the EOC that was, is located in the conference room of our main fire station was not working, and it became even more clear during the pandemic when we had a quad county combined EOC, and there just wasn't enough room. And luckily, I guess, our community center was closed due to COVID, so they were able to pretty much take over that entire building. In addition, we're also in need of a fire station on the east side of Carson City. So the plan is to co-locate a fire station, emergency operations center, and the emergency dispatch center, and use the ARP funds to just fund portion of the emergency operations center. We were a little hesitant about this because we weren't sure if this would be an eligible expense, but I'm trusting GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association. I found their frequently asked questions, and they actually had a specific question Would building an EOC or updating technology in an existing EOC be eligible? And the guidance said, in the context of responding to the public health emergency, an EOC would be eligible under the category of responding to the public health emergency. So that was great news. The sheriff's department asked for a full body scanner, and this will take temperatures of the inmates and aid in social distancing, as the deputies won't have to physically pat down the inmates.
Like they have at the airport.
I should introduce Sherry Russell. I roped her in. She's our chief financial officer. In case anybody had really hard questions, I'm gonna I'm gonna let her answer those. So, senior center restrooms, 400,000. As everyone knows, the seniors are among the city's most vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this funding will be used to update the restrooms to provide ADA-friendly doorless entrances, and then update the fixtures to automatic faucets and flushing toilets to help mitigate the spread of COVID-19. And then lastly, city departments, elected offices, COVID-19 mitigation efforts, 175,000 was allocated there. So with the resurgence of the COVID cases and the reinstatement of the mask requirements, this funding will cover partitions and other non-permeable barriers in city offices. Also pay for if we need any more PPE, sanitation supplies, and then also cleaning services for high traffic areas. Under section 3, services to address behavioral health care needs, investments in housing and neighborhoods, and assistance to workers and families, 1.3 million will be available to nonprofits and other governmental entities. And this will be allocated through an application process. So the entities can apply for funds to provide services under the following categories, and that's mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, crisis intervention, and other behavioral health services, services or outreach to promote access to health and social services, affordable housing, rent subsidies, homelessness, and employment or job training services to address negative economic or public health impacts experienced due to a worker's occupation or their level of training. We did this similar process with the CARES funding, and we will have an application review work group that will review all of the applications to ensure that they meet the eligibility requirements. And then staff will make a recommendation for funding to the Board of Supervisors. Under section 4, investments in improving outdoor spaces, we've allocated $3,080,000. So during the pandemic, the city saw unprecedented use of our outdoor recreation facilities. These spaces promote healthier living environments, outdoor recreation and socialization that still can be done while still mitigating COVID-19. These funds will be used to replace 4 tennis courts at Centennial Park. That's on the east side of Carson City. We'll have the addition of 12 pickleball courts at Mills Park, and also improvements to or the addition of park restrooms. Under category 4, water, sewer, and broadband. For this category, we considered how we could leverage other funding sources with ARP funds to complete these large, very expensive projects. So for example, the Quill water treatment plant, the total cost of that is approximately $9 million. We've requested $2 million through federal appropriations. And then and using $3 million of the ARP funds, that would just leave a balance of $4 million that we would need to issue bonds to finish that project. We also allocated $1 million to our Southeast Carson Sewer Extension project. And we are funding, we're moving up our stormwater capital plan. So we're going to fund our fiscal 23 capital needs for stormwater. Under broadband, invest in broadband infrastructure. We allocated $1 million here. And the city will issue an RFP to solicit projects from providers like Charter Spectrum, AT&T, for the city to partner with to provide broadband services to the households in our community. Lastly, $100,000 for cybersecurity upgrades. So we tried our best. We almost spent the entire thing, but that leaves us 3.7 million to decide to do, decide in the next 3 years what we want to do with that. But we did get direction from the board yesterday regarding the unallocated balance, and they requested that we develop a plan to use a portion for deteriorating city roads and to address homelessness. The funding of the roads, I think we talked about earlier, is only allowed under category 2, replace lost public sector revenue. So this category allows funding to the extent of the revenue losses for the maintenance of infrastructure or pay-go spending for building new infrastructure, including roads. And then my last slide, I just wanted to share some of the guidance documents that I found useful in developing the city's plan. I gave a shout out to NACO down there from one of their presentations. I actually used a couple things from those slides, so thank you. And another thing I just want to let everyone know is that we've also engaged our internal auditors to make sure that we are spending these funds in accordance with all of the guidance. So that's one of their internal audit projects for this fiscal year. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So we have plenty of time for questions, and I guess I'll just open it up to the group and the participants. You're welcome to drop something in the chat if you would like me to sort of convey the question to the group, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question. So I will open it to the participants to see if you have questions. Get that kicked off. Okay, I actually do have one. I'll jump in. So if anyone wants to write down their questions and think about it. But the county manager from Elko, Amanda Osborne, had a clarification. So Aaron, this might actually be a good question for you since you've been speaking with Treasury. So you did a good job, I think, of going over sort of all the flexibility and the ability to provide money to nonprofit resources and outside groups. Amanda's question was, is there a definition or a clarification on what Treasury considers is a nonprofit group? So for instance, she provides an example. Does that include 501c4 organizations?
Sorry, I was just trying to.
Fair enough.
So I'm trying to rack my brain. There was an updated FAQ about the definition of a nonprofit. Shoot, off the top of my head, I do think that it is a C4 too. Just off the top of my head, I'm fairly certain. But if I can come back to that question though.
Sure. Okay. That was the one that I had that someone had dropped in the chat. I don't know.
This is Sherry from Carson City.
Okay.
I had a question with the water and sewer projects. It just needs to fit under the SRF guidance, correct? And be eligible under that. It doesn't have to go through EPA or the Nevada State Revolving Program.
So in terms of the EPA, it doesn't have to go through EPA.
Okay.
But I would just be sure for in terms of the state, you definitely have to be aware of like the state laws associated with those certain projects. Because it could be like subject to additional requirements.
Okay.
Okay, does anyone, maybe I can spark some idea. Does anyone have specific projects that they're working on that they want to include in their plan and they're wondering if they would be allowable? That, and also just to spark a couple of things to get people thinking, I think the lost revenue calculation is, I think was sort of challenging for people at the start, but I think there are a lot of tools out there for calculating lost revenue. But if there are additional questions on that, those might be good questions for the group, or the presenters answered all your questions in their presentations. But I'm happy to keep this open for questions. Again, you can drop questions in the chat box as well if that's easier for folks. And if you're on the phone, it's *6 to unmute. So. Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions. Again, I do want to thank our panelists for joining us and for all of our participants. A reminder that this is a recorded workshop. So this will be up if you want to go back. And also, NACO emailed all of the presentations to all of the individuals who had registered for this. So you can refer back to those workshop materials if you had questions during the presentations, because I think it was a lot of data. If there's no other closing comments from our panelists, we can end the workshop if there are no questions either. All right, I really appreciate everyone's participation. Thanks again.
Thank you, Vince.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Mhm.